everyone. My name is Julie Menders from Otis Library in Norwich, Connecticut. Thank you so much for joining us. This program this evening is called Monsters in the Mills. It's a book launch. We're so excited to have people joining us from all across the country and the world, including right here in Otis Library. We have some people right here in the room with us. So we are celebrating the launch of this new anthology, Monsters in the Mills, featuring tales of the all-too-real horrors of child labor, dangerous machines, and cruel mill owners, set among the haunted ruins and repurposed buildings that are so common in southern New England and right here in Norwich, Connecticut. We have great writers joining us in person and via Zoom. Faye Ringel, who provided the introduction to the anthology, is facilitating this discussion. She is a Norwich native, PhD, retired professor of the humanities at the U.S. Coast Guard Academy, and a wonderful Otis Library volunteer. So I'm going to be handing the program over to Faye. We ask that everyone just please keep their microphones muted unless Faye calls on you. And thank you again for joining us. Thank you, Faye.
Thank you, Julie, and thank you so much for the wonderful adult programming you've provided at Otis Library, and for many years of happy collaboration, bringing writers of science fiction, fantasy, and horror to Norwich. And in fact, one of those writers is joining us tonight from Australia, Karen Warren, who spoke here some years back. And of course, please hold your questions or put them in the chat. And we hope to have at least a couple of minutes at the end to have some interaction. But this is kind of a three-ring circus between the writers in the room and the writers on Zoom and so on. So we're going to do the best we can. And I thank everyone for coming and participating. In the room, we have Krista Carmen, and on the Zoom, we have Lauren Elise Daniels, L.E. Daniels, who are the co-editors of both We Are Providence, the first anthology, and Monsters in the Mills, the anthology that we are celebrating tonight. And this group has just finished celebrating maybe a little too much at the Necronomicon Providence on Saturday night, when there was a huge in-person book launch at that time. So I really have to thank Krista and Lauren for their trans-Pacific work and the sheer amount of work that went into the things they did to help each author make their story as good as they could be. We are being published by Interactive Publications in Australia in their Glass House book imprint. And eventually I'm going to put that information into the chat. I'm also going to put my email into the chat. So if anybody needs to get hold of me afterwards or has questions, whatever, most of you have it, but just in case, I will put it there. So the procedure is that the writers in the room are going to first read their teasers. What all of our writers have prepared for you is a little aperitif to tempt you into wanting to read the rest. And the writers in the room will read their teasers, and then most of the writers on Zoom will have a chance to read theirs. I'm going to start because I wrote the introduction, so I guess it's reasonable that I should start with my teaser for this. By coincidence, I just saw this afternoon Michael Dirda, who was the book critic for the Washington Post, who was a participant at Necronomicon. And when I said the title, he said, "There are steel mills in New England?" And I said, "Did I say steel mills? I said mills." So just to clarify, we're talking about New England's abandoned mills, many of them derelict or repurposed, converted to loft housing. They loom like the ruins of Gothic cathedrals or castles, like relics of a feudal past. The haunted reputation of some abandoned mills today attracts ghost hunting urban explorers, but in their heyday and in their decline, they housed monsters. Serving these monsters sucked the life out of generations of children and young women workers. In these stories, the mill machinery may be monstrous. The grounds or the ruins of the mills may be haunted. The workers themselves, those women and children, may be portrayed as less than human. But the system of industrial capitalism itself is the monstrosity. Factory workers were considered interchangeable, disposable, used up and thrown away when no longer needed or when they unionized. Small wonder they return to haunt us, no matter how we try to repress the memories. The monsters in the basement, the haunted machines, the cannibalistic owners, and more are the outward signs of a system that first fed and then ate its own. And now I will turn things over to Krista. And so I'm hoping each writer will also give just a little bit of context about where their story is coming from. Krista, all yours.
My story is called The Circle, and so I'm sure it comes to no surprise for the people who know me and my work that I really like to delve into, I mean, obviously this whole book is people delving into Rhode Island history, but I try to find, I mean, I've been very into the Mercy Brown legend for years and years and years. So I try to find legends that encompass women, misunderstood women. I like things that have ambiguity to them, that give you some room to play and maybe figure out, even if there's no story available to them, maybe help write the story for them that gives them a bit of justice and vindication for the stories that are available about them. So Dolly Cole has three different, if not more, but three different main legends that are attributed to her. And they vary tremendously. In one, she's potentially a transvestite prostitute. In another, she is a more like vampiric creature. And in a third, she is witch-like and has characteristics of a witch. And that's sort of the legend that I went with this story. And there's both a past timeline and then a modern day timeline that mirrors Dolly Cole. Any rage she had once carried had been spent, taken up by the men and women who'd come for Dolly, who'd come for her from the mills. She was warning me, Dolly realized, all along warning me. Dolly took the water in the ruin of her fingers, the water that fed the mill, and she poured all her rage and hatred, her sorrow and regret into it, as if a dam had burst. With every last ounce of her strength, she whispered, heavy of spirit by my charms, heavy of body every part, always weary human arms, forever crush thy traitor's heart. And Dolly died, while the curse, once a prayer that had been whispered into the sleeping ears of a little girl to direct her dreams, was carried downstream by the water. It would enter the mill and exit it, enter it and exit it, enter the people of the mill and exit them in a circle, forever unbroken.
Thank you, Krista. Krista's story is based, as she said, firmly in Rhode Island folklore. And Rhode Island's Ramtail factory, right there, and that she writes about, you got to read the whole story, was listed as an official haunted place by the WPA guides as long ago as the 1930s. And now we're going to turn to our co-editor, L.E. Daniels, Lauren Daniels, and she too is writing from, we might say folk horror, but from inspired by family experiences. Lauren?
Thank you, Faye. Yes, my story is, it entails two of my ancestors, my grandmother, who worked in both the silk mills and the wool overcoat mills in Connecticut, as well as my father's uncle, who spent 3 days under a tank waiting for assistance in the cold December of 1944 in the Ardennes on the way to the Battle of the Bulge.
So I'd like to actually read two short paragraphs. The first gives you a feel for the conditions that my grandmother worked in. Sometimes sentences ricocheted in Tina's head to the sticky racket of 120 Tradle-operated Singer sewing machines in 120-degree heat. While she drove her hands along the machine, she refused to think about the crawling electrical sensation that plagued every inch of her skin. Here she was, allergic to wool, working in a wool mill, while a heat wave broiled New England without pause and compounded her misery with a vicious heat rash. The mill that manufactured the winter overcoats for the war effort had become an oven, its granite walls luminous with fibers, and its thick oak doors locked to prevent the seamstresses from wandering off for a breath of air. I'd like to share just one last paragraph that gives you just a sensation of my writing and how the story culminates in tragedy. And this is August 1944. Time twists in on itself for the dying. Darkness repeats until somehow it breaks open the very seams of life, torn and rent. A multitude of threads burst from this great chaotic loom, of which Christina was but one. In the roar of flames and whoosh of ash, the screams emptied into inexhaustible tide. There followed a moment, a stirring silence, when the incredible pain stopped, and there was, before everything collapsed like spent cinders, one last explosive expression that reached across time and space. Thank you. That is from Darkness Repeats.
Thank you, Lauren. I guess we could, I'm going around just on my screen. I'd like to feature Mr. Michael Squid, who is not only one of our authors, but also the cover artist. And if anybody has a book you can hold up, you could show.
Hard one to follow. I love that and the way it ends that sentence too. All right, so this is a very different story. It's not as historic or historic fiction as much. I mean, it is, but the early 2000s as opposed to the full fierceness of the Industrial Revolution. But anyways, this story takes place in a repurposed warehouse that's been converted to a punk rock home full of musicians and people living in an avant-garde lifestyle. But I'm just going to jump into this woman's looking for her friend who lives there with her, who left into her room and is gone, but no one's seen her, and there's no way for her to come in or out. And that's kind of the premise. Can you all hear me okay? Okay, just making sure. All right. So Carla's room looked like the same aftermath of an explosion it always did, but it was far too cold. I glanced at the windows, which had been covered with blankets and band posters to insulate the space from the New England air. They were all closed tight. I walked past a frog-shaped ceramic ashtray spilling over with butts to Carla's bed, which was empty. She didn't appear to be home, but her worn leather boots were on the floor, kicked into their usual spot. Her coat sagged on the chair at her desk, and most chillingly, her wallet and keys sat on her desk. She never went anywhere without them. As I stood in the cold room, staring at the details and the shadows, the dread within me grew into a full body shiver as I noticed the hole in the floor past the edge of the bed. A 5-foot wide hole in the floor inspired the fear that she'd fallen through and was grievously injured on some lower level, or worse. Reluctantly, I approached to get a better view. The hole was deep, but oddly enough, it wasn't a puncture through the levels of the building. It seemed to contradict the way buildings are structured, and my mind raced to try to understand it. The hole in the wooden floor was warped inward. The angle was gradual, like the start of a funnel, and it seemed to continue past where the other rooms of the warehouse might have been. The hole was Dali-esque, a bizarre warping of the wood that should have been impossible unless it had been made of plastic, melted and pulled out of shape. "Carla!" I yelled down, praying my voice would summon a response. I dropped to my knees and opened my fraying messenger bag, feeling my way past keys, pepper spray, and the buttons from punk shows I attended. I located the small flashlight I kept for roadside bike repair and shone the beam into the orifice in the floor. The angle was sloping at least, something that brought some relief. If Carla had fallen in, she might not be critically injured. I leaned in to get a better look at the floor beams that all seemed to retain their width and spacing despite their odd curves. Fear for my friend caused me to act rather than plan. I attempted to inch forward, but my boot heel landed at an angle it wasn't used to from the warped floor beneath it. I flailed my arms for balance. Too late. I fell on the ground and slid into the dark hole.
Thank you so much, Michael.
Sure.
Okay, going back to the room, can we have Stephen Bellinger come up to the to the delivery place?
So hello, my name is Steve Belanger. Very quick about the story. This story is actually two stories kind of shuffled together, and it's writing 101 not to do that, but I did it and it worked out pretty well. So I had a story about a guy whose job it was to demo old mills, and his inner hauntings, if you will, brought out the hauntings in the mill that he was working in. But that was kind of like not going much of anywhere. And then I had a separate story going on where another guy was, he had just lost his wife and he was getting what he thought would be phone calls from his wife. And that's been a trope done a million times over. I kind of went with it to see where it would go and it didn't go anywhere. But then I realized the guy receiving phone calls from his dead wife never did mention what his job was. So I realized I could combine the protagonists, and when I did that, the story really just came together. I wrote it in a flash together on New Year's Eve, literally December, at the end of December. Finished it about an hour late for the dinner that my girlfriend and I were supposed to go and see with her friends, but it is what it is. And it turned out, I think, pretty well. So this one is called Blackstone, and actually the title, to give credit, came from Ellie Daniels, Lauren. I didn't like the title that I had for this story, and I was like, just title it anything you want. And she was like, how about Blackstone? So I was like, sure, that sounds great. So it was. So Lauren, thank you very much for that, by the way. So here we go. I'm so sorry, I heard myself say. I had a throbbing headache, a raw throat, body aches and chills, a fever, and I couldn't breathe. I was still all alone and lonely. Some of the pounding in my head had also been Davis pounding on my door. He told me that later, after he'd fired me. I'm sorry, I said again. I wish I could be with you. I placed the receiver gently upon its cradle. I sat there, my fingers caressing it, my head lowered, for a long time. Then I bolted downstairs past Davis and Chris and some guy I didn't know. They were shocked and said something I ignored. I ran into the basement, holding aloft my crowbar, yelling. I took the crowbar to Kenneth Williams' awful painting until it was shredded cheese. There was a lot of shouting, but nobody stopped me. The deep, angry voices, the whispers, the sobs, the children's laughter, all bled into a crescendo in my head, and I screamed louder than before. I was still screaming when I ran into the basement. I dropped my crowbar when I grabbed a medium-sized sledgehammer, leaned against the wall near the door. I carried it with both hands through inch-thick plaster snow, like Jack Torrance carrying his axe through that snow-covered maze. I ran beside the demoed basement wall, seeing again its dark recesses and pockets of solid shadows and emptiness. I stopped, heaving and coughing, in front of the walled-up portion, the section Chris and I had left alone. What corners did you cut? I yelled. What did you do with the bodies in the winter? 12 swings of the sledgehammer brought it down. By that time, two guys had grabbed me by my arms, and I dropped the sledgehammer. Chris and a few others had crowded behind me, and someone had turned on the fluorescents. Davis shined a flashlight into the aperture, the wall reaching just to our knees. Oh no, he said breathless. Oh no. Thank you.
Also, last in our room, Aaron Durgard, The Devolution of Doyle.
Everybody, so my story's kind of about, it's a fictitious mill really, but I kind of imagined it to be in the Pawtucket area. And in doing some research, I learned a lot about the exploits of child labor, and this kind of, you know, the story will paint a picture of that. I don't want to give too much away, but yeah, so the excerpt I'm going to read is kind of going to get into this young man named Doyle as he has to deal with the reality of working in one of these mills. The heat inside Weaver Mill was unbearable. Every day for 12 hours, Doyle felt like he was roasting inside a giant oven. Black droplets slid down his cheeks as sweat coasted over his filthy pores. The cotton dust caused a roaring cough to escape him. As he lifted the dustpan and brush, he blinked several times over, doing his best to moisten his inflamed eyes. The contaminated air not only attacked his lungs, but his entire body. Doyle's oversized head hung forward as he stared at the bane of his existence. Over the last 7 years, the machine had given so much to people: cotton, clothing, warmth. And while it had given to others, in the same stroke it had taken from Doyle, its ear-splitting hiss had destroyed his hearing. The position of the device's architecture had warped his spine. The hazardous dust hampered his breathing in sight. Still, as much as it had taken from Doyle, it had taken even more from others. He looked over at Savina Wyatt. The 8-year-old girl that worked the bay beside him was one of the only workers who bothered to interact with him. Savina didn't judge him for the few words in his vocabulary. And while Doyle's oversized head and hunchback made him look strange, that didn't seem to bother the girl. She noticed his gaze, lifted her left hand and waved. Doyle recalled when she used to perform the gesture with the other limb, back before the accident. Thank you.
Returning to our online readers, how about you, Joshua? You're coming to us from Ohio, right?
Yes, all the way from Ohio. Unfortunately, I don't have a copy of the book, yet. I'm just reading off a page. So I don't happen to have the page number here, so I apologize for that. If my cat starts yowling, I apologize for that too. He's very old. My story is called The Web. Excuse me. And the background is essentially it's about an 18th century mill owner in a Providence-like world. And it has to do with notions of complicity, particularly in regard to slavery in the triangle trade with rum and Rhode Island, being highly involved in that. And I think that's enough background for now. I'll just go ahead and read my little piece here. The moon was enormous, a great disk the color of taper light, and it illumined the cobbled road that led down the hill toward George's humble home. The houses he passed were built on a slant, with sloping stone stoops, pitched side gable roofs, flame-lit multi-pane windows, and flaming tin lanterns hanging from wrought iron hooks beside the doors. More thread festooned their facades like limp chain, rippling in the breeze and rising and falling like respiration. George, trailing his own thread, continued to the town road along the water where the great ships floated, hulking shadows blacker than the dark, their furrowed masts like great crosses rising from their decks. The thread was here too, leading from the wharfs to every house, every tavern, every business, up and along the connecting roads. But it was thickest along the docks, whose pilings appeared almost woven with it. George walked to the water's edge, knelt, dipped his hand in and brought up a handful of the strands. They were fine as baby's hair, though he was reminded of their sharpness by the salt water sting and the cut on his finger, and thought better of attempting to tear them out. Despite appearances, the threads were somehow inexplicably sharp, perhaps unbreakable. Though his rational mind contemplated their origin, his businessman's mind began to ponder how he might utilize them at the mill. Thank you.
Thank you, Joshua. And Joshua is really very modest because he is a trained historian and formerly worked at the John Brown House in Providence. So they're probably not going to be stocking our book in their gift shop anytime soon. Okay, I want to turn to a Connecticut writer, Christy Schoonover, who comes to us from the flooded southwestern part of Connecticut, and I really appreciate her being here tonight. And she produced the lovely bookmarks that that those people who are in the library have been taking. So pretty. And also, I hope that Julie will be capturing the chat together with the recording, because Christy has been doing a wonderful, and others, wonderful annotations, and Lauren of annotations of these stories as they go by. So
Yes.
Christy, all yours.
Thank you. So my story is called Cinched, and just a word about it. My mother died when I was very young. And I don't know much about her, but there are a lot of mysteries that kind of surround the house where she grew up in West Haven. And she grew up right in front of the American Buckle and Cartridge Company, which has been derelict for years. And every time a proposal comes up that somebody wants to do something with it, it's always deemed like too toxic and they can't do anything and it'll cost millions. And so the mystery of that place has haunted me for years. And so when this opportunity presented itself, I thought it would be fun to explore maybe why it's so messed up in a fictional way. There is a thing that roams the halls of my factory turned condos at night. Every stomp jingles like a broken sleigh. When it reaches my metal door, it knocks in groups of 4, with long, dreadful silences between each. For hours, I am afraid to stir, to breathe, but I cannot leave. My condo is in the former American Buckle and Cartridge Company, and the place has been watching my entire life. I grew up in a 3-family house within eyeshot. It marred Campbell Avenue, silent and dreary at Memorial Day parades, ominous and coal black in the bright row of festooned stores at Christmas time. One of its brick and stucco wings, hugged by a cluster of decrepit metal drums, squatted beyond the chain-link fence that hemmed our large garden. Its battleship gray wooded-over windows spied on my uncle and I harvesting vegetables twice the normal size. They were also uniquely colored, not indigo eggplants, but violet. Not vermilion tomatoes, but scarlet. Not leaf green gooseberries, but emerald. We ate our produce at every meal, and it was in high demand in the extended family and neighborhood. Nowhere else had vegetables as tasty. I thought, the way a kid does, that my uncle had Willy Wonka magic. Now, I know better. Thank you.
And I think we have one last writer, and that is Rick Ribello, who, like me, is an academic and has been teaching summer school all this time too.
Yeah, definitely been busy teaching summer school. So my story is called Kiss of Death, and the reason why it's called Kiss of Death is that that was the term used in the early 1900s when women mill workers, literally passed around tuberculosis because they had to suck thread through the bobbins to set up the bobbins to put them in the machines. And as they were sucking the thread through the bobbins, they literally were passing tuberculosis around to each other. In my story, it's set in modern times. A young couple has rented out a mill space so that they could have a business where they resell items from abandoned apartments and houses during COVID, when a lot of people were losing their homes. And so it's kind of sad. And they've set up in a mill, unbeknownst to them, a bobbin has been left behind that holds within it some evil. So here we go. Wanda gazed at the bobbin and became drawn to the hole that was used to thread the line. Could the disease still be there? All of those women who sucked the line through the hole were ignorant of what the bobbin held. Wanda brought it closer to her mouth and stopped just short of her lips. Just then, the line shot out and hit her. It stung like a hornet. She pulled the bobbin away as the line tore her lip. Something then tightened around her wrist, and she raised her hand holding the bobbin and could see the thread inside emerging and slithering around her skin and cinching itself down. Wanda screamed. The echoes of her terror bounced around the walls of the mill. Coarse thread wound its way up her arm. It had grown thicker and longer and slipped from the bobbin like a snake made of hemp uncoiling. The pressure increased until it was on the verge of breaking her forearm. Wanda reached for a box cutter. She extended the blade a good 2 inches and jabbed it into the rope at her wrist, cutting the threads in two. She cried out in pain as the blade scored her flesh. She pulled at the thread and struggled as it fought to stay attached to her. Thick as a rope now, it was trying to burrow into her arm. The threads, like needles, trying to get under her skin. Thank you.
Our last Zoom reader is Paul Magnon, who had a computer crash, but he's back now. Paul is another Rhode Islander, and this is a piece of Rhode Island history too. Go ahead.
Okay, the title of my story is A Spinning Mule, and the spinning mule was a big, long, clackety-clack machine that was used to spin cotton and other fibers. The story is set in present time when a man named Stu robs a convenience store, and he's on the run from the police, so he ducks into what he thinks is an old abandoned mill, where he discovers a young child, a boy of about 7, standing next to a big rusty machine. And Stu thinks the kid's been there for a while, so he tries to be kind and offers him a piece of beef jerky, and my excerpt goes from there. I don't need food, mister. This was said with such serious earnestness it took Stu a moment to process it. What do you mean you don't need food? Only folks who are alive need food. I haven't needed any for over 100 years. Stu slowly put the jerky back in his pocket. Kid, I take a joke as well as anyone, but I'm getting sick of this. My name isn't Kid, it's Claude. Stu shook his head. Okay, Claude, since we're now on a first name basis, my name isn't Mister, it's Stu. Either way, I'm going to find another room to sack out in for a while. Do us both a favor and leave me alone. A low, deep growl shook the floorboards. A terrible grinding noise erupted from the machine. Flakes of rust fell away as rollers, long dormant, squealed on dry rails and sent the front carriage sliding into the stationary back portion with a clack. The moving part glided back and reset in its original position. I don't want you to leave, Claude said, and neither does the spinning mule.
Thank you, everyone. And we have at least a few minutes for questions. I know that Marie put in about the Crompton looms. If you want to, ask, you could ask your question yourself, or.
Did anybody write? I was curious if anybody wrote about the Crompton Loom Works. I'm descended from the Crompton family. Crompton was my maiden name, but they were located in Worcester, so perhaps.
No, we're mainly Rhode Island, and I think all Rhode Island, and Fall River is the furthest we got into Massachusetts. Do you know any? Do you have any stories about those mills?
Oh Lord, we don't have 5 hours or more.
Well, go ahead and write them.
Yeah, there are a lot of family stories. And when I was widowed, a number of my friends around the country said, "Oh, move here." And I finally got everybody to stop saying that when I said, well, I can't be more than 2 or 3 hours from the family crypt. And which happens to be in Rural Cemetery in Worcester.
Oh gosh.
That's very Gothic. That's one. Other people with questions? You don't even have to put them in the chat. You can, if you have your camera on, you can wave.
Hello, everyone. I'm a FOF, friend of Face. We were at the Academy. I'm still there. And I have an older sister who lived in Manchester, New Hampshire for years. And she lived in a mill that was converted into, of course, rooms. And then they had a group kitchen. And I stayed with her, visited her there at times. Every room was like the size of a closet. And I swear it was haunted. And so I just want to compliment everyone on your use of tension building and also of place. because to me, as Faye said about context, is so important in order to understand that little story. But they were fascinating, and I like that the whole tone of them and so forth. So I just want to know if anybody would like to further comment on this symbology of place, as these mills. I don't know, that one seemed haunted to me.
Well,
I would love to respond as well to this. Is such a, thank you so much, Karen.
Oh, yes.
Faye, would you like to respond first?
well, only that it's amazing to us that there aren't more stories about haunted mills, because they are such an important part of New England, but also such an important aspect of still families, that we all have family stories, that we all have that there are still within memory, and yet there's been this erasure. This idea that you can just, as you said, turn them into condos or expensive lofts or whatever, and somehow forget about that history. It does seem as though they ought to be shoulder by jowl with ghosts, because so much, so many years. Other people comments?
Yes. Yes, one is to say that I personally believe my family is haunted by the mill origin story. It just
Oh.
infiltrated the whole immigrant experience. My great grandmother had come over from Italy and went to work doing sewing and tailoring for the wealthy of Fifth Avenue in her apartment by candlelight. I mean, in the apartment buildings there. And then my grandmother went to work at 5, pulling the cocoon threads for the mills in Manchester silk mill. And then that's what Nana could do. She was fast and she worked in the wool factories, the mills, assembling the overcoats for the war effort. And it's the place goes beyond the walls is how it felt for me. And I seem to be fixated now writing these stories and honoring where we are now is because so many toiled before us, and I can't seem to get past that. I feel like I owe them a lot. My grandmother wanted an education and didn't get one because she sacrificed herself really for the family. On a lighter note, I stayed in a converted jam mill. It's the IXL mill in Hobart, Tasmania, and it's this gorgeous hotel, like art hotel down in Hobart now. It's really phenomenal. And these spaces can be converted into absolutely resurrected and airy and wonderful light spaces, but it still smelled like strawberry jam. It was fantastic. So that was just to end on a lighter note. I just wanted to share that because some of these extraordinary, and everybody says it's even the jam mill is haunted. So yes, and I'll have to pass the baton to Christy because I know she has something to say.
Yeah, I do. Thank you, Lauren. That's so awesome. I think as far as mills being haunted, whether you believe in ghosts or not, everything in this world has energy.
Right.
And energy can't really be destroyed, or at least that's the principle. And I think a lot of these places tend to absorb vibes. And I think that's why things can stick around. I personally believe in ghosts, but I do know that some people might not. But that's why I think things stick around, because energy sticks around. So even if you don't have a presence there, those walls absorb things. When we renovated my dad's house, and I'll keep this quick, that house was always a place of sorrow, and you could feel it when you went in there. And I mean, even as a kid, I could feel it in the house. And after he died, of course, the house had to be completely renovated, and we ripped down all of the sheetrock and replaced it with all brand new. And that is all we did. We didn't really like change rooms or anything. We just ripped it all out. And when you walked into that house, that sadness was gone. And I was like, that is really strange, because I thought about that whole idea of wood and brick and all of these things absorbing energy. And so I think that's why when we talk about the mills, it's really important to respect that. And in our stories, we each respected the fact that these were places of sorrow. Even you talk about the Triangle Shirtwaist Factory fire. My brother lived like next door, and he said, I swear, like that place is looking at me. And I said, yeah, because there was so much sadness there. So thank you very much for the compliment. And I know that we all worked really hard on our pieces and in our pieces to reflect that, you know, the sorrow is still in those walls. So yeah, I totally buy into the fact that it's haunted. Totally.
So I'm Steve Belanger. I read Blackstone. So my story, when I was writing it, I thought it was really interesting to combine the sorrow of people who had to work in these mills and how they breathed in all of that cotton fiber, and their lungs all went to heck, and they died of what many of them called mill TB. And to compare that to people whose job it is for 30, 40, I ran into a guy who worked on my house. He'd been doing it for 50 years, tearing down all that wall and getting all that white plaster dust in their lungs, and they also don't have health coverage, and they also deal with physical problems, and they also deal with breathing problems. And it occurred to me that there was that juxtaposition going on, and they're kind of trapped in the same way that mill workers were trapped in those villages, and how those owners owned those mills and villages and the stores, and they pay those people in credit so they couldn't save money. And it really is a present day kind of stuck in that system, just like folks back then were too.
Thanks. I think, I think Rick's had his hand up, and then that'll probably be our last one.
So I just wanted to add that, you know, my parents were sort of that last wave of mills in Fall River. My father worked at Quaker Fabric up until 2005. I did a documentary for PBS about Portuguese immigrants, and one of the things that I did in the documentary was talk to the people that left, because they had this beautiful concept of America being this beautiful place of, you know, milk and honey and opportunity, and to some extent it was. But the sad part in my documentary was seeing how once the mills were closed, all these people who really had no other skills and no education were sort of just left dangling. And many of them were feigning physical injuries or mental injuries or doing anything they could to get disability and stay, you know, functional, stay alive. So it's not something necessarily, you know, from 100 years ago. It's still, you know, very much relative today. And the interesting thing, you know, I don't think any of us mentioned, like, most of these people, Steve was talking about the TB, they were dead at 25. It was rare that they made it to 30.
Wow.
So when Christy's talking about energy, you know, when you have young people dying in these places, you know, that energy of an unfulfilled life is just sitting there sort of resonating. Right? It's not like they even had a chance to really experience so many things. And even in that short period of time, they were still able to have children and, you know, start their children at 7, 8 years old. And they would watch their mothers and fathers die at 25, 26, 30 years old, you know? So, you know, like Aaron said, you know, the mill took from them and they took from the mill, but the mill always had the upper hand as far as that went, you know. But they really their goal was to sort of pay it forward. You know, I'm here because my parents paid it forward, you know. I wouldn't get to do what I'm doing if it wasn't for my dad getting his ribs broken at Quaker Mills back in the 2000s, you know.
Wow, that's a great note to end on. That indeed, these are family stories, and because of these, the generations of sacrifice, we are here today. And Charles, we have on the call Charles Crow, who's one of the foremost American Gothicists alive today, and he'll have to listen to it on the recording. I hope that to be captured. Yes, Lauren just put in the chat, we stand on the shoulders of giants. And I'll quote from Rick Ribello, who wrote, "If every person who died in a mill haunted it, we would be shoulder to shoulder with ghosts." And in a sense, we are the shoulders of giants and the memories that haunt us. And I'm going to thank everyone for being on, and thank Julie for putting together this wonderful hybrid program that's enabled us to bring people in from all around the world, and hopefully others who signed up for the Zoom and will be able to receive the link for the entire recording. And I think that we're ready to say good night. least good night our time, perhaps a different time for others.
And thank you, Faye.
Thank you all.
Thank you. Good night.